For decades, Camilla Parker Bowles was seen as the ultimate victor in the most scandalous love story in British royal history. She stepped out of the shadows, defying public outrage, to become queen beside the man she had always desired, King Charles III. But in a cruel twist of fate, the very light of glory Camilla once chased has now become the fire consuming everything she built. A storm is brewing within Buckingham Palace, and at its center stands Camilla. It all began when Prince William, the eldest son of Princess Diana, decided to break his silence. After years of restraint, he chose the defining moment to reveal Camilla's darkest secret, one that not only threatens the king's honor, but reopens a wound that never truly healed in the hearts of the British people. For them, Diana was not just a symbol of love, but of truth and compassion. And when that secret came to light, the public realized that Camilla was not only the woman behind Diana's broken marriage, but the keeper of an even deeper betrayal. That truth exploded like a media bomb, shattering the flawless image Camilla had spent decades constructing. This is no longer just another royal scandal. It is a war between truth and deceit, between light and darkness, between a son protecting his mother's legacy and a woman long accustomed to living behind a mask. Now, King Charles faces the most difficult choice of his life. Will he walk away from Camilla, the woman who has stood by his side through half a century of turmoil, to save the image of the monarchy? Or is this a long-delayed act of revenge for his first wife, Diana Spencer? The answer could forever change the course of British history. The morning sun rose gently over Buckingham Palace, but inside, behind the thick stone walls and ancient Gothic windows, a silence heavier than any crown rested upon King Charles III. He sat alone in his private study, his frail hands trembling as they hovered over a thick dossier that had been delivered to him in the dead of night. His eyes were weary, but there was no escaping what those pages revealed. Each sheet carried words sharper than steel, and at the bottom of every document was a forged signature that chilled his soul. Camilla's written with a clumsy but deliberate hand. "This cannot be," Charles whispered to himself, his voice barely more than a breath. Yet the proof lay before him cold and undeniable. The papers told a story of betrayal more cutting than any scandal he had endured before. Priceless jewels that once adorned his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, the very pearl she had worn at her coronation, the ruby necklace that had gleamed under grand chandeliers, had been appraised in secret, then sold in hidden auctions across faraway markets. Each treasure that had once carried history and pride was now lost to strangers who would never understand their meaning. Charles turned another page, his chest tightening as if the air itself had been stolen from the room. Balmoral, with its windswept fields and solemn hills, estates that held the memory of countless summers with his family, had been quietly transferred into the hands of faceless companies. Even Windsor Castle's antique vases, paintings, and carved chairs, each piece whispering stories of centuries gone, had slipped away through contracts so shadowed no light could reach them. His breath grew ragged. He pressed his palm to his heart as though to steady it. "Camilla," he muttered, voice breaking like fragile glass. He rose from his chair, gripping the damning dossier until his knuckles turned white. He stepped toward the tall window and gazed out over the gardens. Red roses, Camilla's favorite, bloomed brilliantly in the morning sun. Yet today their beauty seemed false, almost mocking. "You've crossed a line," he whispered, his words trembling as though spoken to the roses themselves. "You've betrayed me, betrayed my mother and the crown." For decades, Charles had learned to endure Clarence. He had weathered storms of criticism, scandal, and whispers that sought to shatter him. He had trained himself to remain calm when the world mocked, to hold his head high when his own heart faltered. But this was different. This was not the world against him. This was the woman he had trusted above all, the woman for whom he had sacrificed his image, his honor, and his peace with his own family. The betrayal tore through him like a silent storm. This wasn't about jewels or estates. It was about memory, about legacy, about the promise he had made to his late mother to safeguard the monarchy she had given her life to protect. Every object stolen carried more than value. It carried history, the necklace, the land, the vases. Each was a fragment of a promise now shattered. He closed his eyes, and in that silence, the ghost of Diana flickered in his heart. Her laughter, her sorrow, her love, it all came rushing back. Had he been blind all along? Had his need for companionship made him ignore truths that had been there, hidden beneath smiles and roses? Charles's voice cracked as he spoke to the empty room. Was it love at all, Camilla? Or was I nothing but a step on your path to power? His body trembled, his fingers digging into the edges of the dossier until deep red lines formed in his palms. Painful questions swirled without mercy. Why had she done this? Was the marriage nothing more than a stage for her ambitions? Had the years of loyalty, sacrifice, and patience been for nothing? The room seemed smaller now, its air suffocating. He turned from the window, his face pale, but his jaw clenched with a strength born from heartbreak. The dossier lay heavy in his hand, yet heavier still was the truth it carried. A king's crown might have been forged from gold and jewels, but at that moment it felt like a chain of iron. Charles lowered himself back into his chair, the silence pressing in once more. His eyes fixed on the roses beyond the window, their petals glowing red as if stained with secrets. He spoke again, his voice steady this time, though his heart quaked inside him. You've not only betrayed me, Camilla. You've betrayed the monarchy, the very soul of this nation. And for that, there is no forgiveness. And on the other side of the world was Camilla. What was going through her own mind at this point? Stay with us. The Queen's mirror and the King's truth. The palace that morning glittered with its usual grace, yet beneath the polished marble and gold lay storms unseen. In the royal bedchamber, far from the silence of Charles's study, Camilla stood before a gilded mirror. She adjusted a silk scarf around her neck, her hands steady, her eyes gleaming with quiet pride. Even in her 70s, she carried herself with the elegance of a woman who knew how to command attention. Her silver hair was perfectly arranged, her smile rehearsed to face the world with confidence. She had no idea, no knowledge of the dossier resting in Charles's trembling hands, no thought that her carefully built web was moments away from unraveling. To her, everything still looked smooth, like pieces on a chessboard she believed she controlled. Every signature forged, every asset transferred, every secret deal made. She trusted it all had been executed with precision, trusted that those who had helped her would never betray her. Camilla's reflection in the mirror stared back strong and sure. This is for the monarchy, she told herself, though her voice wavered inside, for its survival, for stability in uncertain times, yet deep in her heart, she knew there was another truth. It wasn't just about duty, it was about power. Years of criticism had scarred her, the endless comparisons to Diana, the whispers that she did not belong, the eyes that measured her as less than a true queen. All of it burned quietly inside her. Camilla wanted more than survival. She wanted recognition. She wanted to prove she was not merely the shadow beside Charles, but the woman who could shape the monarchy's future. She moved away from the mirror and sank into an armchair, her fingers absently brushing the wedding rings she wore. Her gaze shifted toward the gardens where red roses bloomed, her favorite flowers. A smile curved across her lips. Charles won't understand, she thought, her voice and her mind calm, confident. Then the smile deepened. But he doesn't need to. When all is complete, he will see I was right. He will thank me. She believed she was safe. She believed her plan was flawless. She believed her secret was still hers. But just a few corridors away, Charles stood with the weight of betrayal heavy in his grip. The dossier lay thick on his desk, its edges sharp, its pages filled with truths that sliced deeper than any blade. He lowered himself into his chair, his hands shaking, his breath unsteady. His eyes rose to the portrait of his mother. Queen Elizabeth II stared back at him from the frame, her gaze firm, her expression calm, as if even in death she was watching, waiting for him to uphold the vow he had made. The husband's doubt, The corridors of Buckingham Palace stretched long and heavy that morning, their silence pressing down like stone. For King Charles III, each step he took within those walls seemed endless, as though the palace itself had grown larger with the weight of his sorrow. His mind was no longer steady. It was a storm of questions and shadows. In his study, he sat before the oak desk, the dossier of betrayal still near at hand. Yet today, it was not the forged signatures that shook him most. It was something far deeper, something that pierced not the crown, but the heart of a husband. His phone buzzed relentlessly, each vibration like a cruel reminder of the world outside. Advisors sent urgent messages, aides forwarded headlines, and at the center of it all was a rumor that made his chest tighten with pain. Camilla, his queen at Caifan, his companion of more than 3 decades, had been seen meeting with Anthony Aldridge. Charles picked up the phone, his fingers trembling. The screen glowed with blurry photographs from a London cafe. In them, Camilla sat wrapped in her familiar beige coat across from a man with salt and pepper hair, smiling politely as he leaned toward her. Charles recognized him instantly. Aldridge, the man who had once been part of Camilla's past long before she became his wife, his queen, his greatest controversy, and his fiercest love. Though the images were unclear, the suggestion was sharp. The tabloids had already spread them like wildfire. Underneath the photos, cruel words cut deep. The queen is at it again. Another sneered. Charles should have stayed with Diana. His breath caught. He placed the phone down, then shoved it away with a sudden force. The clatter echoed through the study like a final note of judgment. "Not this," he whispered, pressing a hand to his chest as if trying to hold himself together. "Not her. Not again." The betrayal of the dossier had already stripped him of certainty. Now this rumor struck at his most fragile place, the trust he had built over years of sacrifice. He had believed Camilla understood him like no one else could. He had believed their bond was forged not only in love, but in survival. After decades of scandal, criticism, and loneliness. Yet now, sitting in that study with the palace walls closing in, he wondered if the love he had defended so fiercely had been nothing more than a mirage. He pushed himself from the desk and walked to the balcony, throwing open the doors. The morning air rushed against his face, cool and sharp. Yet, it did nothing to calm the chaos inside him. The royal gardens stretched below, serene and unchanged. But for Charles, they no longer held color. He gripped the railing, his eyes fixed on the roses that Camilla had once tended with her own hands. Once those flowers had been their secret language, blooming as symbols of affection when the world seemed set against them. But now the red petals seemed fragile, reminding him that even the strongest trust could be cut down with a single stroke. "Where did I go wrong?" he whispered into the wind. His voice broke, carried away by the breeze, swallowed by the vast gardens below. Memories flooded him, those early days when he and Camilla met in quiet corners, hidden from the public eye, when she was his solace in a life torn between duty and a marriage that was crumbling. Her laughter, her warmth, her presence had been the only place where he felt truly seen. He had fought for that love. He had endured the scorn of the press, the disapproval of family, and the ache of public judgment. He had lost Diana, and yet he had clung to Camilla with the belief that theirs was a love worth every battle. But now he asked himself whether it had all been an illusion. Did she love him for the man he was? Or was it the power, the crown, the throne, and the history that surrounded him? The questions tormented him, refusing to release their grip. He turned back inside, his body heavy, his steps unsteady. At the desk, he lowered himself into the chair and took a sheet of paper. His hands shook as he held the pen, but he forced himself to write. The words were brief, but each letter carried the weight of his wounded heart. "Meet me at Clarence's house this afternoon." He folded the note and gave it to an aide with instructions to deliver it at once. The study was silent again. The only sound was his own uneven breathing. Charles leaned back, staring at the ceiling as though searching for answers in its ornate carvings. For a moment he closed his eyes, feeling the weight of both crown and heart pressing upon him. Finally, Amari, he mustered courage. So, what did he say to Camilla? And how did this attribute to him leaving her? Let's dive into it. The courage to confront. Clarence's house seemed to hold its breath, as if the very walls sensed the storm that was about to break. Once a sanctuary of warmth, where Charles and Camilla had shared private laughter and fireside evenings, the drawing room now felt colder than stone. The air was heavy, the kind of silence that presses against the skin. Thick silk curtains muffled the light, allowing only faint streaks to fall across the polished wooden floor. Charles stood near the tea table, his posture heavy with weariness. Before him lay the dossier, its presence undeniable, its pages filled with proof of betrayal. Dressed in a plain gray suit, his shoulders sloped with the burden he carried. His eyes, dark with sorrow, revealed the torment within. The door opened softly, and Camilla entered. She carried herself with the same confidence that had always shielded her, though a flicker of unease passed through her eyes when they landed on the dossier. She wore a pale blue dress and a silk scarf tied carefully at her neck, like armor for a battle she had not expected. She offered a faint smile, the kind she had used countless times to smooth tension. "Charles," she said lightly, "what's this about? Another busy day of paperwork, I presume?" Her voice was gentle, but Charles heard the strain beneath it. He did not return her smile. Instead, he pushed the dossier toward her, the motion sharp, his gaze fixed. "Camilla," he said, his voice trembling, but steady enough to cut through the silence. "You've signed things that do not belong to you. This is my mother's legacy. This is the nation's legacy." Camilla's smile faltered. She lowered herself into a chair and flipped through a few pages with feigned calm. "Charles, what are you talking about? These are just administrative matters. You've been unwell. I was only trying to help." "Help?" The word broke from him almost as a shout, echoing across the chamber. He stepped closer, his fists clenched at his sides, his restraint slipping. "You call forging my name, selling my mother's jewels, and handing over royal lands help? No, Camilla, you didn't do this for me. You did this for yourself." She stepped back, the color draining from her face, but quickly gathered herself. "Charles, you're misunderstanding. I was trying to secure our future. The monarchy needs resources. Times are changing. You know this better than anyone. I did what had to be done." She reached out, her hand brushing his sleeve, but he pulled away, his eyes burning with hurt. "Secure," Charles repeated, his voice low, heavy as lead. "You've trampled on my mother's memory, on Diana's memory, on everything this monarchy was built upon." And as if that weren't enough, those meetings with Aldridge. "Did you think I wouldn't know?" The name struck her like a whip. Her lips parted, but no defense came. The blurry photos she had dismissed now returned to haunt her. "Charles," she stammered, "you're blowing this out of proportion. Anthony is just an old friend, an advisor, nothing more. You know I love you. Love me?" Charles let out a bitter laugh, sharp and raw. He turned away, his steps dragging him to the fireplace where a framed photo of their wedding day stood. He lifted it gently, his fingers tracing the smiling faces frozen in time. His voice trembled, bitter and aching. "I gave up everything for you. My honor, my family's trust, the people's faith. I stood by you when the world spat at our feet, and now I don't even know what I've been protecting." Camilla's composure cracked. A chill spread through her as she saw him no longer as the husband who always defended her, but as a man stripped of patience. She stepped forward, her voice soft, pleading. "Charles, listen to me. I should have told you, yes, but I never meant to betray you. I wanted to make us stronger so no one could ever look down on us again. That was all I wanted." She reached for his shoulder, but he stood unmoving, his back turned, a statue of grief and silence. The room was thick with words unsaid, with love bruised beyond repair. Her voice broke again. "Charles, we've endured so much. Don't let this destroy everything we've built. but her words were light against the fortress of his heart. Enough, Camilla. His tone was calm now, but colder than the winter winds that swept across Balmoral. He turned, his eyes stripped of warmth. I need time to think, but hear me clearly. What you've done is not just a betrayal of me. It is a betrayal of the monarchy itself, the Queen's silent battle. The echo of Charles's footsteps still lingered in the halls of Clarence's house long after he left the drawing room. Camilla stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the door he had closed behind him. The silence pressed down on her chest like a weight she could not lift. That room, once their safe place, now felt hollow, stripped of warmth, stripped of love. Slowly she reached out, her hand brushing the fabric of the armchair where Charles had once sat, speaking to her of his dreams for the monarchy, of a future they would build together. For the first time, fear gripped her. Not fear of the public, not fear of the press, not even fear of losing the crown. It was the fear of losing him, the man she had believed would stand beside her until the end. Charles, she whispered into the empty air, but her voice faded like smoke, swallowed by the stillness. In the days after that night, Clarence's house became suffocating. Every corridor felt like an invisible battlefield. The staff moved with guarded steps, avoiding her eyes, their whispers carrying through the walls. She could feel it. He had spoken to them, and now the air carried his disappointment like a ghost haunting her. But Camilla was not a woman to collapse under the weight of silence. She had clawed her way through decades of hatred, ridicule, and whispers that painted her as a villain. She had survived what many would not have endured. And so, when faced with the looming loss of her title, her influence, and the love she had fought so hard to claim, she did not weep. She planned, alone in her private chambers. She sat at her desk, her pale hands rested on her phone, her face lit by the glow of its screen. Her eyes no longer held sorrow. They gleamed with cold resolve. If he thinks I will fade quietly, she murmured to herself, he does not know me at all. Her fingers moved swiftly, numbers dialed, names whispered, plans ignited. With the precision of a chess master, she began moving her pieces across the board. First, the journalists, those who thrived on scandal, those who craved the next great story. She reached them in subtle ways, her voice soft, her tone careful. I only want the truth to be known, she told them. And soon the headlines appeared. The forgotten queen, Camilla, the woman who sacrificed everything. They painted her as a loyal wife burdened with the monarchy's weight, while her husband was consumed by fragile health and memories of the past. She was no longer the villain in their words. She was the victim, and the world began to listen. But that was only her first move. She called upon Annabelle, her childhood friend, who had stood beside her since the days when whispers of scandal could have ruined them both. Anton, the financial advisor, who had quietly aided her dealings, smoothing paths others would have left rough. They met in secret, far from Buckingham Palace's watchful gaze, in a discreet hotel on the outskirts of London. I only wanted to modernize the monarchy, Camilla told them, her voice steady, her tone convincing. Charles clings to the past. If we don't adapt, everything will fall apart. Annabelle nodded firmly. Tom hesitated but eventually agreed, promising to gather support from sympathetic politicians. Camilla felt the ground beneath her strengthen once again. She was building an army not of soldiers but of words, influence, and alliances. Yet her boldest weapon lay away in her own safe. It was a sleepless night when she finally opened it. Her fingers trembled slightly as she touched the bundle of letters. Charles's letters written in the days of his first marriage, words laced with guilt, with longing, with weakness. In those pages was a version of Charles the public had only guessed at. If released, they could wound him, tear apart what remained of his image, and shatter the trust he had fought to rebuild. She did not want to use them, but knowing she could give her power, with a steady hand, she sent a message through a trusted intermediary. If you want this to end quietly, talk to me. Don't force me to do what we'll both regret at Buckingham Palace. Charles sat before a glowing computer screen, reading the headlines that praised her sacrifice. Each line cut him deeper. The woman he had defended against the world was now painting herself as the abandoned queen, while he appeared cold, distant, unfit. Camilla, he whispered, his voice breaking in the empty room. What are you trying to do? He knew she wasn't fighting just for survival. She was fighting for power, and the knowledge twisted in his chest like a sharp cut. Reports reached him of her secret meetings. Whispers reached him of her threats. And then came the message about the letters, the past he wished to bury, now raised like a sword against him. He stood at the window, his eyes on the gardens below, the roses blooming in the late sun. Once those roses had brought him peace, reminding him of the beauty his mother cherished. Now they mocked him, blooming with colors that felt sharp, cruel, unkind. He was trapped between two paths. Yield to Camilla and protect his heart one last time, but at the cost of his honor, or confront her and risk her wrath, her revelations, and the storm she would unleash upon the crown. But one more person had a different idea. Stay with us. You'd never regret it. The heirs stand. The days that followed the storm at Clarence house weighed heavily upon the royal family. Silence filled the corridors like a warning bell that refused to fade. Every servant stepped lightly. Every voice dropped to a whisper, as if the palace itself braced for a battle yet to be fought. Camilla believed she had secured her footing, with her carefully woven media campaign and loyal allies whispering in her ear. She thought she had tilted the crown in her favor. Yet what she could not see was another figure, calm but watchful, quietly tracing every thread of her plan, Prince William. For years, William had been cautious of Camilla, his instincts telling him she wore masks too easily. When a trusted servant came to him with news, snippets of overheard calls, names of secret allies, and mentions of plots, his suspicions hardened into certainty. And when he read the newspapers portraying her as the noble, neglected queen, something within him snapped. Those words were not merely lies, they were an insult to his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, whose devotion had defined the monarchy, an insult to his mother, Diana, whose memory still lived in the heart of the nation. William clenched his fists as the headlines stared back at him. The forgotten queen, the sacrificing of Camilla. He would not allow the truth to be buried beneath her schemes. It was time to act. But first he needed his father's blessing. One late afternoon, William entered his father's study at Kensington Palace. The room smelled faintly of old leather and burnt wood from the fireplace. Charles sat at his desk, hunched over a letter. His eyes looked weary. His shoulders bent as if he carried centuries of weight. In his hands was an old note from Camilla, ink faded, edges worn, a reminder of a love he had once believed unshakable. William stood tall, his jaw set. His voice, when it came, was low but edged with fire. Father, he began, I know what Camilla is doing. She is not only taking from us, she is twisting the story, rallying allies and threatening you with those old letters. We cannot let this go on. You must act now. Charles lifted his gaze, pain flickering in his tired eyes. His lips trembled as he set the letter down. William, he said, his voice breaking, you don't understand. She is the woman I have loved all my life. I have protected her through storms, through ridicule, through the hatred of the world. How can I turn against her now? William's eyes darkened. He stepped closer, the weight of duty sharpening his tone. Father, I do understand, but love cannot blind us when betrayal stands so clear. She hasn't only betrayed you. She has betrayed us all. She has insulted grandmother's memory. She has mocked my mother's legacy into these three components: the royal duty, the air ambulance pilot. If you cannot move against her, then let me do it. Give me your permission. For a long moment, Charles said nothing. The air between them was thick with unspoken pain. Then, stiff remembering his own mother's words, a king protects not just his heart, but his crown. Charles exhaled deeply. All right, William, he whispered, his voice weary. Do what you must, but be careful. Camilla is not an easy foe. With his father's reluctant blessing, William acted swiftly. He gathered a circle of trust, those whose loyalty to the crown was unshakable. At the center of this alliance stood his aunt, Princess Anne, the unwavering guardian of their mother's legacy. William laid the evidence before her. Forged signatures, suspicious asset transfers, and the manipulative press clippings. Anne's eyes grew hard, her jaw tightening. She will not destroy what my mother built, Anne said firmly. We finish this together. The two worked with quiet precision. They reached out to reputable newspapers, men and women not blinded by Camilla's spin. Documents were passed. Financial experts verified the truth, and soon new headlines blazed across Britain. The Queen's asset conspiracy, the truth behind the forged signatures. The tide shifted. Where once Camilla had drawn sympathy, now outrage erupted. William struck harder still. He turned his eyes on Camilla's allies. Annabel, her loyal childhood friend. Tom, the advisor whose hands had moved money in secret. They were summoned quietly, their choices laid bare. Stand with the crown, William told them, his voice cold as steel, or fall with her. Annabel, shaken and fearful, chose quickly. She confessed, offering proof of Camilla's private meetings. Tom resisted at first, clinging to ambition, but as his political allies began to abandon him, he too crumbled. Camilla's empire began to collapse. At Clarence house, Camilla sat in her study, her hands trembling as she scrolled through the latest reports. Her phone buzzed endlessly, but the voices she longed to hear had fallen silent. Annabel had vanished. Tom had sent only one brief message. I cannot help you anymore. The journalist who once took her side now hunted for her downfall, eager to expose every secret. Headlines screamed betrayal, Queen Camilla's money laundering scandal. The words burned her eyes. She pressed a hand to her chest, the fear unlike anything she had ever known. This was not the fear of whispers or gossip. It was the fear of ruin. She rose, walking to the window where roses bloomed in perfect order. Once they had comforted her, symbols of beauty against the storm, but now they mocked her. She could not win this war, not against William, not against Anne, not against the legacy that bound them all. When King Charles ended it all, it began like a storm no one could stop. Newspapers, radios, and television across Britain carried only one story: Queen Camilla's scandal. From the loud markets of London to the quiet cottages in the countryside, her name was whispered in anger, in shock, and in betrayal. The headlines were clear. The Queen had abused her place, and the evidence could no longer be hidden. For King Charles, the truth was heavy. For years, he had defended Camilla against all voices of doubt, against every whisper of disapproval. But this time, the evidence was not a rumor. It was real. It came not from strangers, but from his own family. His son William and his sister Anne. They had uncovered proof that could not be denied. Forged signatures, hidden accounts, and royal assets quietly slipping into the shadows. Charles could no longer stand still. He called for something rarely done in modern times: an emergency meeting of the Royal Council at Buckingham Palace. The palace, usually a place of ceremony and tradition, became that night a court of judgment. The council chamber glowed under heavy chandeliers. Crimson tapestries lined the walls. The portraits of past kings and queens watched silently from their golden frames, as if waiting to see how history would turn. Charles sat at the head of the long table. His hands were clasped tightly together, as though holding back the storm inside him. His face looked pale, his eyes dark with sleeplessness, but his posture was firm. William sat to his right, his jaw set, his eyes burning with quiet determination. Beside him was Anne, calm but unshakable, her presence as sharp as steel. Around them sat other senior royals, advisors, and legal voices, all silent, all waiting. The door opened. Camilla entered. She walked slowly, wrapped in a deep blue silk dress that seemed too rich for the moment. Her chin was high, but her eyes betrayed her unease. She was no longer a queen walking into a court of respect. She was a defendant walking into a court of truth. Charles looked at her, his eyes soft for a single heartbeat before hardening again. William stood, his voice carried across the chamber, steady and strong. "Members of the council," he said, "the evidence before us is undeniable. Queen Camilla has abused her authority. She forged my father's signature. She transferred royal assets without permission. She manipulated the press to protect herself. This is not only betrayal of the king, but of my grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, and of the crown itself." He sat and Anne rose. Her tone was icy, but her words were clear. "We have all seen the transactions. We have all seen the secret accounts. This is not an error. It is deception. Camilla has broken the trust of the family and of the people. This cannot continue." The room grew tense. All eyes turned to Camilla. Her voice trembled when she spoke. "I only did what I thought was best for the monarchy," she said quickly. "Charles, you know I never meant to hurt you or the crown. I wanted us to be strong for the future. I wanted us to survive in a new era." But her defense was met with silence. William's eyes cut through her words. Anne's expression did not move. The council members waited. Then Charles raised his hand. The room fell quiet. He rose slowly, his voice low yet sharp as glass. "Camilla," he said, "I have spent my life protecting you against criticism, against anger, against every voice that told me you would be my downfall. I stood by you." His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the table. "But what you have done is not a mistake. It is betrayal. You trampled on my mother's legacy. You dishonored Diana's memory. And you mocked this nation's trust that I cannot forgive." Camilla's lips parted, her eyes wet with tears. "Charles, please," she whispered. "Give me one last chance. I was wrong. Yes, but I love you. You know I love you." He turned his face away, unable to bear the sight of her broken plea. Memories of their years together, years of laughter, of defiance, of struggle rose like ghosts in his mind. But those memories no longer healed him. They only burned. "Your last chance is gone," he said, his voice choked with pain. "It ended the moment you chose betrayal over me, over this family, over the crown." He took a breath, then delivered the words that would cut deeper than any blade. "From today, you are removed from all royal duties. You will have no access to archives, assets, or decisions. You will live apart at Highgrove, and every step you take will be watched." Silence fell across the chamber. Camilla swayed where she stood, as though her heart had stopped beating. She searched Charles's face for a sign of softness, for even a flicker of the man who once loved her so fiercely. But his eyes were cold, his resolve unbroken. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "Charles," she whispered again, "please." But the king did not look back. William and Anne exchanged a glance. They both knew what this moment meant. It was not just a punishment. It was the final breaking of a marriage Charles had defended for decades. The council members nodded one after another, accepting the decision. The heavy doors of the chamber closed, and with them ended one of the most painful chapters of the monarchy. So, what was the aftermath of her ban? Let's see that. A garden of shadows. Once Highgrove House had been a place of joy, a private paradise where Charles and Camilla laughed, whispered secrets, and believed love could conquer everything. But now that same home has turned into a gilded cage. The world outside called her the disgraced queen. And within the quiet walls of Highgrove, Camilla lived in exile, stripped of power, cut off from the crown, and bound only by memories she could not escape. Surrounded by Gloucestershire's rolling green fields, the estate looked like heaven to any passerby. But for Camilla, it was no longer a sanctuary. It was a prison. Every morning she walked slowly through the famous rose garden, the one Charles had planted for her with such devotion. The roses, rich and red, had once been tokens of his love. He had knelt in the dirt with his own hands, carefully tending each bloom as though tending their future. Now each petal stung her heart. The fragrance she once adored mocked her. The roses whispered of what she had lost. His trust, his love, and the life she once dreamed of ruling by his side. Her steps crunched on the gravel paths. Sometimes she stopped and brushed her fingers over the flowers, her eyes filling with tears she rarely allowed herself to shed. "How did it come to this?" she whispered one evening, her voice so faint that only the wind answered her. The media, once her weapon, had turned against her. The very journalists she once charmed, now splashed her across their front pages with cruel names. The disgraced queen, the betrayer of crown and country. Her allies had melted into shadows. Annabelle, Tom, and the politicians who once promised loyalty no longer called, no longer wrote. They had abandoned her as if she were contagious. Even the staff at Highgrove, though polite, looked at her differently. Their bows and curtsies felt empty, their eyes filled with quiet distance. She knew they saw her not as queen, but as a fallen figure, no longer belonging to their world. At night, Camilla sat in her simple bedroom, staring at the desk before her. There lay an unfinished letter. Many times she tried to write to Charles, her hand trembling over the paper. "Charles, forgive me," she wrote once, but the words felt hollow. "No letter can erase what I did," she whispered. Setting down the pen, she thought of the forged signatures, the hidden dealings, the secret meetings. Each action, each decision had built a wall so high that even love could not climb over it. Finally, one evening, she folded the letter and tossed it into the fireplace. She sat still as the flames consumed it, the smoke curling upward like the last traces of hope. Far away at Buckingham Palace, Charles lived in his own solitude. He carried the crown with steady dignity, yet behind closed doors, he was a man wounded by love and betrayal. In his study, surrounded by portraits of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, and of Diana, he felt the weight of history pressing upon him. The crown sat on his desk, heavy with more than gold, heavy with memories. As the sun set one evening, golden light filled the room. Charles sat alone, holding a small ring in his hand, a gift he had once given Camilla in the earliest days of their love. He turned it slowly, his eyes clouded. "I lost the woman I loved," he whispered, his voice breaking in the silence. "But worse, she was never truly mine." The words cut deeper than any wound. He had given her everything, his trust, his protection, his heart. And yet, in the end, he realized she may have loved power more than him.